I don't know why that thing stopped by itself, but let's just pick up where we were. Okay, the last thing I think I said was that because everything was falling apart, everything was so confusing that nothing could be done to address the problems being faced by the country. So here we are. By the way, what that means is that lecture 2 is rather short. Okay, and now we are in lecture 3. Okay. Some events of historical significance take place during the 1850s, especially in the latter part of the 1850s. Remember that Kansas is literally burning by this time. The pro-slavery, anti-slavery factions are literally killing each other in Kansas over the issue of whether Kansas will come into the Union as a free state or as a slave state. The idea of popular sovereignty. The Kansas question brought the role of violence in the abolitionist movement into focus. And one of the most violent of the anti-slavery people, the abolitionist people, was a man by the name of John Brown. Now, John Brown had been very active in the violence, in the anti-slavery violence in Kansas. But Brown literally was a fanatic. When you see the photographs, and there are photographs, by this time photography had been perfected, and we have photographs of John Brown, and he is a scary looking dude. He looks as if he would just as soon kill you as look at you. And I think that that's probably true. John Brown wanted to crank up the war in Kansas. And he wanted to make sure that the abolitionist faction had better weapons than the pro-slavery faction. And so John Brown, along with some of his sons and some other supporters, came to Virginia to a place called Harpers Ferry. Now, at Harpers Ferry at that time, there was a United States Army arsenal there. That's one of the places where the U.S. Army stored its extra weapons. Well, that's where the weapons were, and so that's where John Brown attacks in an attempt to take possession of these weapons. His goal was to get arms for slaves in the border states, not just the anti-slavery faction, but his goal was to go that step further and arm the slaves so that they could rebel against their masters. Slave rebellions never, in the United States, slave rebellions never were successful. And one of the reasons why was that the white slave owners were much better armed than the slaves. I mean, the slave owners had rifles and pistols and stuff like that. And what did the slaves have? A hoe, a shovel, right? A cane knife. Of course, that scares me to death, cane knife. So he wanted to arm the slaves. The raid was used by pro-slavery people to show that there was, in fact, this abolitionist conspiracy to lead slaves into revolt. Now, and there wasn't. Now, that was John Brown's goal, and we can't deny that. But was there this wider conspiracy to arm the slaves? And no, I don't see it. The United States government sent the United States Army to Harpers Ferry, which is in West Virginia, by the way. It was in Virginia at that time. West Virginia later comes into existence. Harpers Ferry is in West Virginia. But the United States Army sent soldiers under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. How about that? And his His assistant was another man who would become a famous Confederate general in the Civil War. His name was Jeb Stuart. Two really famous names in American history, but they are both in the U.S. Army at this time. It's 1859. They're still both in the U.S. Army, and those two men put down the John Brown raid on Harpers Ferry, and Brown and some of his followers were eventually executed. They were hung by the neck until they were dead. And of course, one of the more famous songs that comes out of the United States Civil War. The lyric is, "John Brown's body is a moldering in the grave." And it was sung to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Now, I'm no singer, but let me do this. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. Okay? That's the song. And that's the last time that you will hear me sing in this chorus. Now, the election of 1860, the presidential election of 1860, rolls around rather soon after Brown's unsuccessful raid at Harpers Ferry. Now, in 1856, let's go back just a few years. In 1856, the Republican Party was brand spanking new. The new version of the Republican Party was squeaky clean, brand new. And they had run their first presidential candidate, unsuccessfully, by the way, in 1856. And one of the reasons that I'm not even going to mention his name because it was an unsuccessful campaign. The Republicans were not well organized. In order to have a successful presidential campaign, you've got to be organized in every state, all the way down to the local precinct level. And the Republicans were simply too new to have been able to organize. But by 1860, they were organized. Because in 1860, their candidate was Abraham Lincoln. And of course, you know that campaign was successful for the Republicans. Now, what was the platform of the Republican Party in the 1860 election? Well, everyone knew that the expansion of slavery was tied to sort of the free soil movement. Prior to 1862, land for westward expansion had been by purchase, either directly from the government or from land speculators. Additionally, surprisingly, the Republican platform did not have an abolitionist plank. They simply opposed the expansion of slavery. So in many ways, they were more anti-slavery than they were abolitionists, weren't they? The early version of the Republican Party. The Democrats in the election of 1860 do what I mentioned a few moments ago. They split into two factions. We refer to them as the northern wing of the Democratic Party and the southern wing of the Democratic Party. The leader of the northern wing was the man that we've mentioned several times already, Stephen Douglass. The leader of the southern wing was a man by the name, I think he was from Tennessee, but don't write that down because I'm not sure. But nevertheless, his name was John Breckinridge. Now, let me get ahead of my story here and tell you that who were the Democrats then? You got two wings. Well, if you lived in the North, if you were a merchant, if you were a businessman, if you were a rather well educated, the chances are likely that you would have been a Democrat. There's also a likelihood that if you were Irish or German, a new immigrant, that you would be a Democrat as well. And the northern wing of the Democratic Party was fundamentally opposed to the issue of slavery. What about the Southern wing? That's a different story altogether. The Southern wing, if you were white and Protestant and living in the South, itchy nose, I'm sorry. At this time, the chances were likely that you were a member of the Southern wing of the Democrat. Slave owners generally were Democrats. And so you can see that even though both factions called themselves Democrats, there are some really fundamental issues, fundamental differences, rather, between the northern wing of the Democratic Party and the southern wing of the Democratic Party. Now, here's where I want to get ahead of myself. Let me tell you this. It is the southern wing of the Democratic Party that starts the American Civil War. Not so much the northern wing, but the southern wing. So that's a good, oh, I'm sorry. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, southern states begin to leave the Union. They begin to secede. South Carolina, of course, is the first one. And as the southern states begin to secede, the United States is really, they're just amazed that this is happening. And the government almost comes to a standstill. There's so much confusion in the national government as the southern states begin to secede, because what that also means is that southern senators are leaving Washington and southern members of the House of Representatives are leaving Washington, and they are going home to their individual states. Now, some southerners do stay in Washington. Even if their state secedes from the Union, they stay in Washington and they continue to work as U.S. senators or U.S. representatives. They are permitted to. What caused the Civil War? Boy, we've been debating this one for a long, long time, haven't we? And have we really reached agreement on this issue? No, not really. Because people tend to have really strong feelings about this, and many people refuse to change their minds. Okay, so let's talk about, let's approach this from a historical point of view, hopefully from a neutral point of view. The South seceded generally because they truly felt that the two economic systems, right, free labor, slave labor, could no longer exist under a common government. Remember what was happening. We've talked about this already. One of the questions on the midterm dealt with this issue. The industrial development in the North and the continuance of the plantation system in the South. I mean, could two things be farther apart? Why didn't the North just let them go? Well, the North felt that the things that held the states together, the things that everybody had in common. What were the things that everybody had in common? The law and the Constitution. Okay? The Northerners felt that the things that held us together, the law and the Constitution, were more important than what held us apart, which is freedom, slavery, industrialization, agriculture. I'll find my place. All right, we're back. No matter the differences between the North and the South, they proved to be irreconcilable. It couldn't be fixed. Now, was it because people were stubborn? Was it because they were right? Who knows? And it's not our job to figure that out. What we know is that eventually 11 southern states secede from the Union and form the Confederacy. And the result is a war that lasts for more than 4 years. That war is still the most costly war in terms of human life and human agony that we have ever fought. Even World Wars One and Two, when you add them together, the casualties of those two wars don't even come close to how bad the Civil War was. But finally, and this is not a Civil War course, so I'm simply going to say, let me spoil the story for you. The North wins. Okay? The North wins that war. And the issues that caused the war are, at least on paper, settled as well. What we know is that the Congress passes 3 amendments to the Constitution that we still refer to as the Civil War amendments, even though only one of them was actually created during the Civil War. But all 3 were the result of the war, and so it's proper to call them Civil War amendments. The 13th Amendment. What in the world does the 13th Amendment do? Well, very simply, it frees the slaves. Okay? It frees the slaves. It outlaws the institution of slavery, not only in the United States, but in United States territory. So not only may slavery never again exist in the United States, it can't take place in Puerto Rico or Guam or places like that that are territories of the United States. The 14th Amendment, among other things, gives citizenship to the former slaves. And it gives full citizenship. It doesn't give partial citizenship. It gives to the former slaves, the people who are now referred to as the freedmen, one word, freedmen. It gives all the rights of citizenship to the freedmen, including what I consider to be the most important right as an American citizen, and that is the right to vote. Now, the 14th Amendment does other things as well. It does other things in addition to giving citizenship. It also punishes anybody who, having taken an oath of allegiance to the United States, breaks that oath and supported the Confederacy. There were real consequences. There was a price to be paid for changing your allegiance, changing your loyalty. Okay, and the 15th Amendment, very specifically. The U.S. Constitution, I like this feature of the Constitution. Whenever and some of you have heard me say this before if you've had my Constitution course, whenever the Constitution wants to make the point that something is really important, it says it twice. Okay? So there's no doubt. It uses different words, but the message is the same. It'll say something twice. Well, the 14th Amendment, part of the 14th Amendment just sort of casually mentions that if you are a black adult male, now that you're free and now that you're a citizen, you have the right to vote. It just sort of glosses over that. But the 15th Amendment is very specific. It repeats that. It says that if you are an American citizen, you have the right to vote. And nobody can take that, and no state can take that right to vote away from you. So, the 3 so-called Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. Now, one of the other things that the 14th Amendment does is if you were someone who supported the Confederacy in the Civil War, you lost your rights of citizenship. And of course, that was hundreds of thousands of Southerners who lose their citizenship because they supported the Confederacy. And it doesn't matter how you did it. You know, you're in the Confederate Army, you're in the Confederate Navy, you serve in the legislature, the Congress of the Confederacy, you serve in a state legislature, or you just by your actions support the South. you lose your rights of citizenship. Now, what that means is that most Southerners, now remember, no women can vote yet. That's going to happen, but not yet. So who can vote in the South before the Civil War? White adult males. Who can vote now that the war is over? Well, not most. Most adult white males are banned from voting. The only ones who can vote are white males who did not support the Confederacy, and those were rare, but there were some like that. And there were some people who were from the North who came to the South after the war was over, and of course they could vote. But what was the largest voting bloc in the South after the Civil War ends? It's the former slaves, adult black males. They can vote. So who are the voters during what we refer to as Reconstruction? All right. There are what are referred to as the scalawags, Southerners who never supported the Confederacy, carpetbaggers, generally white Northerners who came down here after the war was over, and black freedmen, black male freedmen. Those are the groups who can vote. And during Reconstruction, which ends sort of officially in 1877, black Americans, especially black Southerners, because that's where most black Americans were, right? They flocked to the polls in huge numbers. Those people instinctively understood how important the right to vote was, and they voted. They voted faithfully. And it shouldn't surprise us that the party that most black Americans supported during this time was the Republican Party. It had been the Republican Party. You don't hear it that much anymore, but at one time the Republican Party was referred to as the Party of Lincoln. Right? Lincoln was a Republican. Lincoln led the United States during the Civil War. Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. Literally, Lincoln sacrificed his life for the Union. And as a result, black Americans were huge fans of Abraham Lincoln, and they were huge fans of the Party of Lincoln. That is why I assigned Nancy Weiss's book, Farewell to the Party of Lincoln, as a book review book this semester, because it goes into great detail in explaining how black Americans made the transition from being huge supporters of the Republican Party to being just as huge supporters of the Democratic Party today. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because I want you to read the book and find out for yourself what the book says about that transition in American history. All right. Now, even though some slaves had learned trades, they were shoemakers and they were blacksmiths. And are you aware that beautiful ironwork in the French Quarter, almost all of that stuff was created by hand by blacksmiths. Even though blacks were craftsmen, the overwhelming majority of slaves were workers in agriculture. They might have been a gang laborer. We all know what that is, right? Or they might have worked at the task method. We know what that is. But whatever it was, the chances are likely that they were out in the field growing something, tobacco or rice or cotton or sugar or something. So the slaves, and they had been doing that since the 1600s. The slave, if nothing else, the slaves were expert farmers. When the Civil War ends, what do the slaves want? That's a legitimate question. What do the slaves want when the Civil War ends? They've got their freedom. That's what they really wanted all along. But now they've got that. So what else do they want? Well, they want what the white guys have. And I don't mean they want to take it away from the white guys. I mean this in a more of a philosophical way. They want to be able to worship the way they choose. Remember that during slavery, whenever the slaves worshipped, they would go to church with their master, right? They would hear the same sermons that the master heard. If the church was big enough, if it had a balcony, of course now the whites and the blacks didn't sit together, except maybe a wet nurse, a black wet nurse, would sit next to the baby's mama, right? But generally, the races were separated in the church. The blacks would sit up in the balcony if there was a balcony, or they'd sit on the back row if the church was large enough. Or if the church was small, they would raise the windows in the summertime, and the slaves would sit outside where they could hear the pastor deliver his sermon. But the slaves were never happy with that. One reason, the main reason, I think, is because that the pastors generally preached two different sermons. You know, my wife and I have been married in June will be 54 years. I believe that there's a special place in heaven reserved for my sweet wife for putting up with me for 54 years. She has accused me since the day that we got married that I have selective hearing, that I hear what I want to hear. And maybe she's right. Maybe so. What is true is the pastors thought that the slaves certainly had selective hearing. For example, they normally divided their sermons into two pieces. The first part would be delivered for the benefit of the whites in their congregation. And it was standard Christian sermon, love your neighbor, right? Go the extra mile for your neighbor, turn the other cheek, those types of messages. And then, once they finished that sermon, they would turn to the slaves in the congregation, and they would preach a completely different content. And it always was the same thing. Slaves, obey your masters. Slaves, be obedient. Right? That was the message that the slaves got Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. And as a result, the slaves, they would sit there on Sunday morning and they would listen to all this stuff. And you can imagine what was going through their mind. Oh, God, not again, right? Because on Sunday night, when they got back to the slave quarters, then they worshiped the way they wanted to. There was most plantations of any size had a man who knew his Bible, right? Some were fortunate enough to be able to read the Bible. And so the slave preachers would preach much more legitimate sermons to the slaves themselves. When freedom came, one of the first institutions in the South that was remember, the churches in the South were biracial. That's not the same as being integrated, all right? They were biracial. They were composed of whites and blacks. Of course, the blacks were there against their will, but nevertheless, they were biracial. Churches across the South almost immediately became either lily white or totally black because black church goers removed themselves from the white churches and began to create black churches for themselves. So one of the things that the former slaves wanted after the Civil War ends is to be able to worship as they choose. And some of the black churches in America are very old churches because and you can date them from almost from the end of the Civil War until today. What else did the former slaves want? Well, they wanted education for themselves and especially for their children. It was illegal in many southern states to educate a slave. That's why the story of Frederick Douglass is so unique. Remember Douglass? By the way, Douglass with two S's on the end. Frederick Douglass was a slave in Baltimore, Maryland. His master, his owner, had married a woman from the North, and she was not really familiar with how slavery worked. And so she homeschooled her children, and she invited young little Frederick to join them. She didn't say anything unusual about that. He was a kid. She was educating the white kids, so let's educate little Frederick too. And the story is that the story told by Douglass himself is that he just sucked up this knowledge. He loved going to school. He loved learning. One day, the master came home unexpectedly and saw Frederick, along with his children, receiving the lectures, and the master threw a fit and ordered his wife to stop teaching the little slave boy. And she did. Right? But Frederick Douglass had had a taste of what an education is, and he didn't want to give it up. And so he contrived different ways to continue his education. For example, he would steal cold biscuits from his mistress's pantry, and he would go down to the docks there in Baltimore to play with the white children. And he would basically buy lessons. You teach me, you finish teaching me my ABCs, and I'll give you a biscuit. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but Frederick Douglass, in a large part, was educated by trading cold biscuits for knowledge. And why did he have to do that? Because many states had laws banning the education of slaves. It was thought that an educated slave was a dangerous slave. Think about this for a moment. How you can sort of figure out where that thinking comes from. Masters could, in fact, free their slaves, couldn't they, if they chose to? What happens? But you've got to have the documentation, don't you? The slave master has to write a manumission order. And manumission is a fancy term for freeing the slaves, right? You've got to have a document that says, my name is Bill Smith and I am freeing this slave. And you got to sign it, and you got to date it, and all right? What would keep an educated slave from writing his own manumission papers? It happened. This is no doubt. It did happen. Didn't happen commonly, but it did happen. And so you can see the fear of the white slave owners with regard to educating the slaves. I mean, they could literally free themselves by writing their own freedom papers. Also, it was not uncommon. We all have this idea that the typical Southern farm was like Tara in Gone with the Wind, this huge plantation, thousands of acres, hundreds of slaves. No, that's not even close. What we've said is that first of all, most Southerners did not own slaves, and those that did, the average number of slaves on the average farm was 5, 6, maybe 7. Now, let's say that you're a young black male slave, and you want to get married. The chances are likely that there won't be a young, healthy slave girl on your farm that you can marry. So what does that mean? Well, you're doomed to be a bachelor for the rest of your life. So what happens is that many slaves would find partners not on their farm, but on nearby farms. Maybe 5 miles down the road, there's a farm, and on that farm, there's a young black lady slave who's facing the same problem that you are. No husband, and so the two slaves get together, maybe at a Christmas dance or something. Right? They fall in love, and they ask their masters for permission to marry. Normally, the master would agree to that. Now, remember, they're still slaves, though. They're husband and wife, but they're still slaves, and they're living on different farms. In order to see each other, that means that usually it's the young man, it's the young husband. On the weekends, he'll walk to the nearby farm where his wife lives. And they will see each other on weekends, right? And of course, in the meantime, they're making babies. Now, remember that the babies take on the condition of the mother. So the baby, the child of a slave woman is also a slave. And because the mama is living on that farm and the daddy is living on that farm, the children stay with the mama. And so as the husband travels to the nearby farm on the weekends, he travels there to see not only his wife, but see his children as well. The problem is that many southern states pass laws that say that slaves cannot be on the roads by themselves unless they have documentation from their owner giving them permission to be on the roads. All right, that was a long story to make this point. If you're an educated slave, you can write your own pass, can't you? Any day, any night of the week, right? You forward your own pass and you can go see your wife and your babies. And slave owners didn't like that at all because they liked to have total control. They liked to be the one writing the passes. They liked to be the one giving the permission to go see the family. Because sometimes they would use the fact that the wife lives on one plantation and the husband lives on another to discipline the husband. But think about this. Bill, you have not been doing your work properly this week, and I'm going to punish you. But I'm not going to whip you. I'm not going to do any of that stuff. I'm just going to simply not give my permission for you to visit your family down the road this week. Well, I don't know about you folks, but I would think that would be a pretty good disciplinary tool, because I can think of nothing else more precious than visiting my wife and my children on the weekend. And if I'm not able to do that, I am a miserable person. And the masters knew that, and they took advantage of the emotional connection between husbands and wives and families, and they used this to force obedience. And in this case, hard work.